Watching the Watchers by Jesse M. Zimmerman. The G20 protest and the aftermath have rocked Toronto to its core, revealing newly visible layers within its activist communities, its politicians, and perhaps most importantly, in its police force. Through most mainstream media and public discourse, these events have largely polarized Toronto residents and commentators into binaries, those for the police and those against the police. These two categories are simplistic and neglect the heart of the debate, firstly by boiling the discourse down to an either-or fallacy, and secondly by shifting all eyes onto the police themselves rather than the politicians who have thus far gotten off easy compared to the police. Although I would argue that the politicians definitely deserve most of the blame for the erosion of civil liberties for the duration of the G20, as well as creating the situation in which these violations would be acted out, it seems that the nature of the police force and their power have been made more apparent to the public eye since that fateful weekend. The politicians may be blameworthy, but questions need to be asked in lieu of the massive arrests of peaceful demonstrators and mistreatment at the hands of the police. Police forces are being criticized openly by many citizens, although most politicians, including most of the city councillors in Toronto, seem to have nothing but praise for their actions. Questions and direct criticisms that have long remained in the fringes of open public discourse, though, are surfacing clearly and finding their way into the mainstream. To many activists, particularly anti-poverty activists, these questions and criticisms are nothing new. Many people from marginalized communities and backgrounds have felt the sting of police brutality, intimidation, and/or complete negligence. Their voices, being already marginalized as it is, have seldom been heard beyond word of mouth, alternative press, and occasional mentions in mainstream sources. Typically, when a case surfaces in the mainstream arena, they are dismissed as bad apples, and nothing more is said, whether or not the police officer or officers in question get charged. Easy to dismiss these cases and continue to believe that most police officers are good. Many throughout the activist communities here in Toronto and elsewhere have long believed there is much more to this, and that the tired conjoining of the words bad and apple can no longer suffice to explain away trends of harmful police behavior. There is something much more holistic, something structural that needs to be addressed. Growing up, I had usually admired police officers. We are generally raised to respect police officers and encouraged to go to them when we need help. I always felt a sense of security growing up, as there was a force out there that would protect me if need be. Going to high school in the Jane Finch area, I had long heard stories from other students about police brutality and arbitrary arrest. I chose to believe that these individuals either had encountered the bad apples we always seem to hear about, or that they must have broken the law at some point. My awakening came one night when I was attacked outside a house party. The altercation itself was a bit of a long story. Let's just say adolescence, heaven, drinking, and misunderstandings make a bad combination. I ran away from my attackers as they outnumbered me, eventually finding my drunken and battered self in a low-income area parking lot near a strip mall. My friend, who was at the party and had started searching for me, found me there, relieved to see I was relatively unscathed, and started to explain that a police car was nearby, but that he had already approached them and that they refused to help. We started approaching the car, waving our hands, though I was hardly able to walk properly without my friend's assistance. The car drove off slowly. Over time, I came to forgive the perpetrators who jumped me, as we were more or less kids at the time, but I find that I can never forgive those police officers. They were paid to serve and protect us all, and there was no excuse for their purposeful negligence that night. Even if they had somewhere to go, the least they could have done was called an ambulance for us. How could they know I was not bleeding? People had been known to die hours after a beating due to internal bleeding. If the thrashing had been more severe, if the perpetrators were angrier, I may have died that night, and the police would have been equally responsible as the attackers. At the time, I tried to rationalize these two cops as bad apples and nothing more, but further experiences taught me otherwise. Over time, I realized where so many of the frustrated youth had been coming from, why they felt the need to join gangs rather than to depend on protection from police, and why they had become bitter towards the society that police claimed to represent. The police had failed so many people in the already marginalized community, I realized, either through actions or inactions. The issue, though, is not whether the apples are good or bad, and this weary cliche needs to be permanently retired. There may indeed be some, if not many, police officers who are good people. The issue is not one of merely good or bad cops, but rather one of power relations. Think of it. Juxtapose the power between a police officer, someone we give training and weapons to, moral authority, and the constant benefit of the doubt, with, for instance, a youth of color from an area like Jane and Finch, someone who has likely grown up without privilege, who is routinely assumed by many in society to be a criminal already, someone who has not been educated on their rights as a citizen, who never gets that benefit of the doubt from society. Is it a shock to find out that a police officer could harass, intimidate, and even injure this marginalized youth without any provocation and very likely get away with it? Would the media believe the youth over the police officer? Would the youth enter a police station to make a complaint, knowing that he may be opening himself up for further intimidation? Can we really be shocked at this dynamic or be surprised by this reality? The existence of these power relations creates an environment where such things can easily take place. The G20 showed the city openly the potential for police brutality, arbitrary actions, and direct neglect. It is nothing new to those of us who have already lived with this reality already. The last century alone has demonstrated the horror that unchecked power can generate. No matter the intentions of the empowered, a lack of checks and transparent restraints inevitably leads to the suffering of the non-powerful. The root of the problem lies with the structure of policing itself rather than the supposed moral beliefs of the individual officers. Unlike most organizations that are publicly financed and meant to serve the public, the police force has not embraced the concept of pluralism. The tragic death of a young man recently in the Jane and Finch area may be an example of this. Police officers who were present claim the young man simply dropped suddenly and died, while many community members believe the police officers themselves caused his death. The case is still being investigated, but the Special Investigations Unit, SIU, is made up of members or ex-members of the police force, which many have voiced as problematic. This case, whether the officers were responsible or not, exemplifies the lack of pluralism within the police force. More transparency in public operations and third parties being assigned to investigate such matters as this would likely be beneficial. Is this not the time to start discussing the feasibility of such tools for transparency? If not now, then when? The G20 may have caused many strong feelings on either side of the polarized debate, but perhaps an alternative discourse can emerge from all this. Perhaps the time should be coming when the public stops giving the police the automatic benefit of the doubt. Perhaps a discourse should form that deals clearly with the question, who watches the watchers?